After the death of WCW in 2001, there was no real competition to WWE's throne in terms of North American wrestling. But that's not to say there weren't other companies you could watch. No, while it might never have had the reach of a Ted Turner, there was a televised alternative out there in TNA. And it's a promotion that would go through many ups and downs throughout its history and is thriving to this very day. But how did it get to this point? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into the rise and fall and rise again of TNA. It all began in 2001. That was the year where, within the space of a matter of months, both ECW and WCW died and were bought out by Vince McMahon for pennies on the dollar. Obviously then, this formally brought an end to the Monday Night Wars, but as fans soon learned, the lack of competition this now left was going to be a bad thing for the industry overall, as it not only meant less jobs for wrestlers, but also less incentive for the surviving promotion to push themselves to be at their best. Thankfully though, we weren't going to be without another company for long. No, over the years, others like Ring of Honor would rise up. But one thing ROH never had was a good television deal, a crucial thing if you want to reach a bigger audience. Now, if you wanted to find that from a non-WWE company post-2001 and pre-2019, you'd have to look towards Jeff Jarrett. Why is this? Well, it was while on a fishing trip with his father, Jerry Jarrett, around this time that Jeff started questioning what the future of the wrestling industry in North America was going to look like. If it was indeed going to be a monopoly, then this was something he was not looking forward to. But what could he do? Well, he could try to start a new company with his dad, himself a legendary wrestling promoter of the iconic Memphis territory back in the day. After all, Jerry still had a fair bit of money from those days. And upon leaving WWF in controversial fashion in 1999 when he held up his boss for money, Jeff had been able to get a cool sum from Vince McMahon, with him always claiming this was simply cash he'd been owed but hadn't been paid. Whatever the truth behind that situation though, the end result was the same. Both Jarretts had the capital. So after bringing in a third party to help them out with the day-to-day, wrestling journalist Bob Ryder, they'd get set with creating a business plan. Sure, there was no way they were going to get a TV deal this early on with no proven track record and no full-time roster to speak of, but what they could do was try and build up a track record through weekly pay-per-view offerings. Basically, the plan here was simple. Put on weekly shows at a budget price and try to build an audience that way, selling themselves as an alternative to what WWE were offering, with the hope being that this would eventually net them a TV deal. Yes, every Wednesday night going forward for the price of just $9.99, you could watch 2 hours of wrestling that wasn't being created by Vince McMahon. And that all led us to their first ever show on June 19th, 2002, a show which didn't exactly set the tone well. No, immediately problems became apparent with what TNA was doing here, in that rather than providing an alternative to the WWE product, it felt like it was just copying their style with gimmicks like the Johnsons, a tag team who dressed up as giant penises. Sure, Ken Shamrock would be there to walk out of the show as the new NWA World's Champion, something that was able to happen on account of TNA officially joining the National Wrestling Alliance. But overall, the feeling was that this was less something cool and new, and more another budget version of what was happening over in WWE. But when you learn that one of the most prominent creative voices in the company during those early days was Vince Russo, it makes a lot more sense this would be what happened, as he was the man who'd spent the late 90s booking WWF and who gave us the infamous WCW 2000. Hell, it was him who was allegedly responsible for the promotion's name, with it being a typical Russo pun which was meant to allude to T and A, and not that of the Test and Albert variety either. Still though, even if there was a lot of WWE light material to TNA during those early days, there were some things which made them stand out and gave them hope of being a viable alternative. One of the biggest of which was the fact that, rather than having a traditional 4-sided ring, they took the 6-sided ring found in much of Lucha Libre and brought that up to America, with this making them visually stand out from WWE. On top of that, they also had a secret weapon in their X division, a division which, as we were told at the time, wasn't about weight limits, it was about no limits. And this lack of limitations gave us some of the most exciting matches found anywhere in the world during the early 2000s. Seriously, it was the X division which led to the rise of people like Low Ki, Amazing Red, and AJ Styles, the man who'd in many ways go on to become the ace of TNA. That said, even if these were all positives for the fledgling young promotion, it wasn't enough to get people to buy their weekly pay-per-views in any real numbers. So it was then that mere months after they were founded, TNA was dangerously close to going under. And that's when they were offered their first of many lifelines when the Carter family, owner of a number of power plants across the world, decided to purchase it and save it at the last minute. In doing so, though, Dixie Carter, daughter of the Carter clan, would be placed in charge of the day-to-day running of the company, with this pretty quickly causing friction to develop between her and the Jarretts. You see, while the Jarretts were very much old-school wrestling people, Dixie was not. No, prior to her father purchasing TNA, she knew absolutely nothing about the industry. And this meant there would be a lot of clashes between both sides when it came to what was best for the promotion going forward. So many headaches would this cause. In fact, come 2005, Jerry Jarrett would exit the company entirely. But for as many problems as were being created by Dixie Carter, she was able to secure one major win for the Nashville-based company when, in 2005, she got them a TV deal on Spike TV. To say this was a game-changing for TNA then would be an understatement, as it meant that, for the first time, they'd truly be able to reach a nationwide audience. And to help boost their visibility as they did this, they'd bring in a bunch of ex-WWE names like Jeff Hardy, Raven, and Rhino. But it was none of these new signings which really stood out the most for fans there in the Impact Zone. No, the one who stood out the most was a former ROH World Champion by the name of Samoa Joe. Yes, if there were anyone who could challenge AJ Styles' moniker of the Ace of TNA, then it would be Samoa Joe, as back in 2005, there was a very real argument to be made that he was the best wrestler in the world. And if you needed any evidence of that, all you had to look at was his now iconic three-way match against the Phenomenal One and Christopher Daniels over the X Division title at the 2005 Unbreakable pay-per-view, a match which to this day is still considered by many fans to be the greatest in TNA's history. Really then, with Joe, AJ, and guys like Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian, Chris Sabin, and Petey Williams all bringing the work rate, all TNA needed now to get themselves to that next level was a true superstar wrestler, someone they would soon find in Kurt Angle. That's right, after being fired by WWE in 2006 over concerns about his painkiller use, the Olympic hero was brought in by Dixie Carter. And while concerns about his health would remain here too, he was able to deliver big time for the promotion, with his series against Samoa Joe immediately upon arrival still to this day representing a high watermark of popularity for TNA. No, they were nowhere near the levels of WWE. Hell, they weren't anywhere close to what a WCW had done before or what an AEW would do later, but what TNA had done with the Joe Angle series was finally legitimize themselves as a real alternative for fans who were looking for something they weren't going to find in WWE. At that point then, it truly felt like any early concerns about their stability as a business were gone and that they were now going to be around for a long time. Really, if you're a longtime TNA fan, then this is likely a period you think of as the company's golden era, the point where everything was just clicking and truly felt like it had something. And that feeling would continue for the next couple of years, with TNA continuing to give their fan base what they wanted in terms of excellent wrestling, all while the main event scene was being bolstered by the addition of people like Christian Cage and Sting. Yes, it would be in early 2006 that the Stinger became a full-time member of the promotion after years of having made one-shot appearances here and there. And when other big names like Booker T, Kevin Nash, and Scott Steiner were brought on board, it would lead to another period fondly looked back upon by TNA fans today, the run of the Main Event Mafia. Basically, the idea behind this one was that all of the top guys in the company, ex-WWE stars Angle, Nash, Booker, Steiner, and WCW stalwart Sting, would come together as a giant heel collective, one which would eventually be brought down by a union of babyface homegrown talent in Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, Christopher Daniels, and others. Unfortunately though, like with so many storylines to come in the future for TNA, this one would never really get the payoff which solidified that homegrown talent as being the true top stars of TNA going forward. No, while things like the X Division continued to steal the show in TNA, and while the Tag Team Division was given a lot of weight down in Nashville with acts like Beer Money Inc. and the Motor City Machine Guns, something which further differentiated it from WWE. Come the late 2000s, there was already a sense that TNA was relying too heavily on ex-WWE stars. And that was painting the promotion in a bad light overall. The joke at the time was that the whole place was turning into a retirement home for older talent who'd made their name in WWE. Sure, guys like Styles and Joe would get their runs on top, but they were never treated like the guy in doing so. No, it was always clear that they were playing second fiddle to the real stars, the ones from WWE. That said, one division where this kind of thing wasn't a problem was in TNA's women's division, the one they labeled as their Knockouts division. Why was that? Well, for one, there weren't a lot of female legends to take from WWE back then. No, this was back when ladies wrestling in WWE was arguably at its lowest ebb with the Divas era. But as a counterpoint to that, TNA were actually providing some of the best women's wrestling seen anywhere at this point in time, something they did by presenting the women as athletes just like the men and letting them fight. Yes, a full decade before WWE had their own women's revolution, TNA were killing it with a division that included the likes of Awesome Kong, Gail Kim, and many others. And so popular would these ladies prove to be with the fan base, there were points when they became the biggest draws on the entire show, bigger than even the likes of Kurt Angle and Sting. Still though, this wasn't enough for Dixie Carter. No, despite TNA being in a strong place, complaints about the over-pushing of ex-WWE guys aside, she felt that they needed to go bigger, and it was what she did next in order to try and achieve that goal, which almost sunk the promotion entirely. Sure, it might have seemed like a good idea on paper to bring in Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff in early 2010 as the new creative team, because in Hogan you had probably the biggest star in all of wrestling history, and in Bischoff you had the guy who led WCW to such a high during the mid to late 90s. But in hindsight, all this did was strip TNA of its original identity and leave it crippled to a degree it would never fully be able to recover from. You see, Hogan and Bischoff's goal in joining the Nashville-based promotion was simple. They wanted to restart the Monday Night Wars by moving Impact to a live spot opposing Raw every week. The only problem with this, though, was, in order to do that, they thought they had to make the company feel more like WWE, something they did by taking away things like the six-sided ring. And as if that weren't enough, they'd bring in even more ex-WWE stars, enough that any of the homegrown talent who'd been hoping to break through to that top level on a long-term basis suddenly realized was never going to happen for them. No, now rather than being a company built on Samoa Joe and AJ Styles, it was one being built on the likes of Rob Van Dam, Bully Ray, Mr. Anderson, and Ric Flair. And as for the new Monday Night Wars, well, they'd be a disaster for TNA, as with them not being anywhere near the popularity of WWE even at their peak, they quickly realized they'd bit off more than they could chew here and were forced to retreat back to their old night of Thursdays after only 4 months. And that wasn't the only low point for Impact fans around this time. No, it was also here that as Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff continued to take over the show, AJ Styles was given an absolute stinker of a gimmick when he became a Ric Flair clone. Really, the message here was clear: if it wasn't something that got over during the late 90s, then it wasn't good enough for this new version of the company. But all that pales in comparison to the true nadir of TNA, the one which came in March of 2011 when, at Victory Road, Jeff Hardy managed to get down to the ring for his planned main event match with Sting while being high as a kite. Yes, one look at Jeff here made it clear for all to see that he was in no condition to perform, and this led to Bischoff having to come out to the ring prior to the bell ringing in order to relay instructions to the Stinger, telling him to quickly pin his opponent and get the show off the air before someone could get hurt. And while this happened without any injuries occurring, the fact things had been allowed to get to that point was a major black eye for the promotion, and just another excuse for fans who were getting tired of the whole thing to tune out. Hell, if this wasn't reason enough, then they were turning off the channel when they saw things like the infamous Claire Lynch storyline or the saga of Aces and Eights, Eazy-E's latest attempt to reheat the NWO angle. Understandably then, all of this had a pretty negative effect on the locker room, with morale reaching a low point around 2013. That was the point where, after years of serving as TNA's secret weapon and their true ace, AJ Styles would leave when Dixie Carter tried to lowball him on a new contract. And once AJ was gone, others would leave too soon thereafter, with the coming months also seeing the exits of Samoa Joe, Bobby Roode, Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian, and company founder Jeff Jarrett, all people who had helped to build the very identity of Impact. Honestly, after the high point that was the mid-2000s, this, at the time, felt like an ultimate low point for TNA, as their very foundations had been gutted and replaced with a turn of the millennium WWE and WCW tribute show. And it wasn't just on screen where things were falling apart. No, there were also issues behind the scenes too. You see, during its entire history, TNA had never actually made any real money. Rather, they'd been kept alive by the continued investment of the Carter family, and come 2014, the Carters were starting to grow impatient with their lack of return on their investment. Then, of course, there was the public perception of Dixie Carter here, someone who, by her own admission, hadn't known a thing about wrestling prior to becoming the president of TNA back in 2002. The image she had back in 2014 was that of someone who was completely out of their depth running a pro wrestling company, and whose only idea of what a successful promotion could be was what WWE and WCW had done during the Monday Night Wars. Hell, this was why she kept using Vince Russo as a creative consultant in secret, even after Spike TV had long since asked that he be removed from his position on account of his ideas consistently bringing ratings for the show down. And it was this continued usage of Russo which almost dealt another killing blow for TNA in 2014, as it was then that after Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff had split the year prior, and after most of the remaining big names like Sting had also left, an email mistakenly sent to network executives rather than Dixie Carter herself revealed that Vince was still involved in creative. This then was the final straw for the network, as at that point they'd formally boot TNA off the air. That's right, after all this time and all they'd survived, it looked like TNA was going to end as a result of an email being sent to the wrong person. Thankfully though, this would not be the case. But even if Impact did survive here, it was only barely, as for the next few years they'd limp from small TV station to small TV station, going from places like Destination America, Pop TV, and even Twitch at one point. Really, this was the lowest ebb for the company, as at that point they were alive only by a technicality, with bankruptcy never being more than a few days away. So bad would things get that, at a certain point, the TNA name was deemed to be so toxic and synonymous with disaster, the promotion decided to rebrand itself entirely in 2017 by changing their name to Impact Wrestling. That said, even this couldn't do much to turn things around. No, the problems of the same people in leadership remained, as fan ire continually pointed back towards Dixie Carter. Really, as far as that audience saw it, the Carter family had successfully managed to turn the brand they once loved into something which was basically just another indie, a place where people who'd been fired from WWE went to rebuild themselves before returning to the big leagues. So low did things get here, and such an issue did money become. There were reports of wrestlers who were holding world titles at Impact during this period being forced to get second jobs in order to pay the bills. Really, this seemed like a point there was no coming back from then. But then something would happen in 2017 which gave a little bit more hope. There would be a new management brought on board. Yes, this was the year where, after the Carter family finally decided they'd had enough of sinking money into the promotion only to see no financial return, they'd allow the place to be bought by Canadian media company Anthem Entertainment. And because Anthem was Canadian-based, this meant there would be a lot of upheaval behind the scenes, with the entire promotion now moving its headquarters north of the border and running many of their shows from there. But most of the people who were still remaining, fans and roster members, were happy to follow along with this if it meant the possibility of a resurgence for TNA. Would it lead to a big turnaround? Well, not right away, as this was still somewhere with barely any notable names to speak of anymore, and a continued reputation which would take a while to shake off, but at least now there was a chance of change being in the air. And that change would start to present itself before 2017 was over as it happened, because once Scott D'Amore, former member of Team Canada, was installed as the new head of creative, he quickly proved to have a much better aptitude for booking than the people in his job prior had. Hell, it was him who was largely responsible for rebuilding a new roster out of the ashes of what once was, a roster which would include the likes of Moose, Josh Alexander, Eddie Edwards, Jordan Grace, and Deonna Purrazzo. And on top of that, it was also Scott D'Amore who was smart enough to realize his company's place in the wrestling ecosystem now, which was why he focused on getting things stabilized again with quietly good shows, rather than worrying about trying to bring Impact back up to its mid-2000s level of popularity. No, the reality towards the end of the 2010s was that TNA was never going to reach that level again, with this being especially true once AEW entered the market in 2019. But that didn't mean Impact couldn't still be a promotion worth watching once more, and one which could thrive in their own way. All D'Amore had to do was slowly rebuild its reputation to the point that people might be interested in checking it out. Sure, this was easier said than done, as regaining fan trust once it's been lost can be a very difficult and lengthy process. But the roster Impact had now seemed up to the task. And things were made a little bit easier for them once they got a new TV deal with Access TV in 2019. No, this was not a major network by any means, but it was another step in the right direction for a promotion which, only a couple of years prior, felt like it was truly on its last legs. Then, there were the partnerships Scott D'Amore was able to cultivate for Impact, most notably the AEW partnership, which began in late 2020. This allowed the now Canadian promotion to get their world title seen on a large TV station once more, after Kenny Omega won it as part of his belt collector gimmick. On top of that, the fact that Omega, as well as other AEW stars, would then make occasional appearances on TNA TV and pay-per-views in order to further this crossover helped buy rates and TV ratings to increase incrementally. Unfortunately though, come 2022, the AEW partnership would end. And though at the time the reasons for this weren't known, it's since come out that Anthem had wanted to sell the promotion to Tony Khan, only for him to decide against this. Why were Anthem looking to sell? Well, while Impact was in a better position than it was a few years prior when they first purchased it, it was still not something they were making any real money on. And with the North American landscape now having two big promotions again, they knew there was going to be a ceiling on how high they could rise in the future. Still, despite this, Scott D'Amore remained determined to turn things around fully, with the next step in his plan coming in January of 2024 when he announced that, going forward, Impact would be rebranding as TNA once more, something he hoped would bring a bit more positive buzz to the brand. And while this did bring some positive buzz, that buzz would once again be extinguished when, after a very well-received hard-to-kill pay-per-view took place that month, which saw the new top acts in the promotion like Moose, Jordan Grace, and Joe Hendry continue their rise, D'Amore announced he was parting ways with the company. What happened here? Well, apparently there were disagreements between him and Anthem Entertainment about the direction of TNA going forward, with the rumors being that Scott wanted to pump more money into it and make a push to take it up to a higher level in the wake of the positive PR they were getting again. For Anthem's part, however, already looking to sell the company, they were hesitant to invest much more into the whole endeavor. So when neither side could reach an agreement, it was decided that the best thing to do was for D'Amore to leave and start his own Canadian indie promotion, Maple Leaf Wrestling. Of course, now that Scott D'Amore was gone though, a new day-to-day boss would have to be brought in, with this soon happening when Anthem executive Carlos Silva was put in charge. And it was under Silva's new regime that the unthinkable would happen. TNA would forge a relationship with WWE. Yes, after years of standing in opposition to them, Impact were now going to be working with the WWE directly, with their working relationship seeing a lot of crossover between TNA and NXT, so much so that by the time late 2024 had come along, the two shows were entirely existing in the same universe. Yes, in 2025 it feels like TNA has been fully integrated into the WWE system. Sure, they're not really being acknowledged on the main roster that much, but when it comes to NXT and WWE's most recent purchase, AAA, it's not uncommon to see people like Joe Hendry, Mike Santana, and Masha Slamovich all over those shows. Hell, as of the time of this video's recording, the TNA World title is being held by an NXT star in Trick Williams, and all of this has led to the company getting more buzz than it has in years. Just look at the fact that their recent Slammiversary show pulled in an audience of 7,000 people, an all-time record for them, and a sign that things have really turned around. Where will they go from here? Well, the rumors are that a sale is still coming in the not-too-distant future. And while one of the forerunners to buy the company would have to be WWE, there has also been some scuttlebutt of TKO bringing in Lorenzo Fertitta, the former owner of UFC, to buy the company and work with them directly going forward. Of course, if either of these parties end up with ownership of Impact, then it'll secure their future financially. And if either of these parties could help TNA get a new TV deal, then all the better. Yes, for somewhere that was so close to going under so many times, this is vindication for anyone who's stuck by them all that time, as it's proven that the company started by the Jarretts all those years ago really can survive anything, and can do more than that. They can continue to thrive and live on for decades to come.